The wind howled like a dying animal against the cabin walls, but inside the silence was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. He held the carved wooden spoon mid-air, his grizzled jaw completely frozen. She had warned him. She had begged him not to taste it. Now, one bite had just unraveled the deadliest secret in the Montana Territory. The winter of 1887 hit the Bitterroot Mountains with the kind of sudden, violent malice that froze livestock standing up and buried homesteads under 10 feet of unrelenting white. Silas Caldwell knew the signs of a widowmaker storm. He was a mountain man, a solitary trapper who lived higher up the timberline than any sane man dared to tread. With shoulders as broad as a yoke and a thick dark beard coated in a layer of frost, Silas pushed his exhausted black gelding, Goliath, through the rapidly deepening snowdrifts. The temperature was dropping so fast it felt like a physical blow to the chest with every breath drawn. He needed shelter, and he needed it an hour ago. Through the blinding whiteout, his icy blue eyes caught the faint, rectangular shadow of an old line shack. It was a rotten timber structure abandoned by a prospector named Josiah Higgins 3 winters prior. Silas dismounted, his boots crunching heavily through the crust of the snow, and dragged Goliath toward the lean-to attached to the side of the cabin. After tying the shivering beast and tossing him a meager blanket, Silas turned to the cabin door. He didn't bother knocking. In this weather, survival was the only etiquette that mattered. He threw his shoulder against the weathered pine door, expecting it to give way with a groan. Instead, it was barred from the inside. Silas stepped back, wiping the ice from his eyebrows. A squatter? He hammered a heavy fist against the wood. "Open up. It's 30 below out here, and I ain't looking to freeze on your doorstep." Silence answered him, save for the shrieking wind. He stepped back, lowered his shoulder, and hit the door with the full force of his 200-pound frame. The iron latch inside snapped, the wood splintered, and the door flew open, accompanied by a swirl of snow that invaded the dim interior. Silas stepped in, reaching down to unholster the heavy Colt Peacemaker strapped to his thigh, but he froze. Standing 10 feet away, illuminated only by the flickering orange glow of a modest hearth fire, was a woman. She was small, perhaps in her late 20s, enveloped in a woolen coat that was 3 sizes too large for her. But what caught Silas's immediate attention was the Winchester 1873 rifle she had leveled dead at his chest. Her hands were shaking violently, but her dark, desperate eyes were steady. "Close the door," she ordered. Her voice was raw, laced with terror but underscored by an undeniable steel. "Close it, or I swear to the Almighty, I will drop you right where you stand." Silas slowly raised his calloused hands, keeping his movements deliberate and unthreatening. He kicked the splintered door shut behind him, plunging the room back into the dim warmth of the fire. "Easy now, miss," Silas rumbled, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone. "I'm just a trapper caught in the whiteout. Name's Silas. I don't want any trouble." "Keep your hands where I can see them, Silas," she said, her finger tight on the trigger. "Take your gun belt off. Slowly. Use your left hand, drop it by the door, and kick it away." Silas assessed the situation. He could probably draw and fire before she pulled the trigger, but he wasn't in the business of shooting terrified women. He did as he was told, unbuckling the heavy leather belt and kicking the Colt into the far corner. "All right, you're holding all the cards," Silas said, stepping closer to the fire, desperate for its warmth. As he approached, the scent hit him. Hanging from an iron hook over the flames was a heavy cast-iron Dutch oven. The aroma rolling off the boiling broth was intoxicating, rich, savory meat mingling with herbs that Silas couldn't quite place. His stomach violently protested its emptiness. He hadn't eaten anything but hardtack and dried venison for 3 days. The woman lowered the rifle an inch, though she didn't relax her stance. "I'm Cora. Cora Smith. You can stay by the fire until the storm breaks, but you stay on that side of the room, and I stay on this side." Silas nodded, taking a seat on an overturned crate. He stripped off his frozen gloves and held his numb hands toward the flames. He watched her from the corner of his eye. She claimed her name was Smith, but everything about her screamed otherwise. The coat was ragged, yes, but beneath it, the hem of her dress was made of fine, dark silk, completely impractical for the Montana frontier. Her boots were scuffed leather, but they had delicate brass eyelets. Her skin, though smudged with soot and pale with fear, lacked the deep, leathery weathering of a frontier woman. "You're a long way from a parlor room, Cora Smith," Silas observed quietly. She stiffened. "Mind your own business, mountain man. You wanted a fire, you have one." As the hours passed, the storm outside worsened, shaking the cabin to its foundations. Silas thawed out, but his hunger grew unbearable. The stew over the fire bubbled, filling the small space with an agonizingly delicious scent. Silas leaned forward. "I have coffee in my saddlebags. I'd be willing to trade a pot of it for a bowl of whatever you're boiling in that kettle." Cora stepped quickly in front of the hearth, using her body to shield the iron pot. Panic flared in her eyes. "No, no," Silas raised an eyebrow. "Miss, I'm starving, and I can smell that meat from here. I ain't asking for charity, I offer to trade." "It's not for you," she said, her voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "I'm telling you right now, Silas, do not taste my food." Silas frowned. "Is it spoiled? Meat gone bad?" "Just leave it be. It's medicinal. It's for me," she stammered, gripping the rifle tighter. "I said no, and I mean it. Don't taste my food." Silas leaned back, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "Suit yourself." But his mind raced. Medicinal? That was a lie if he ever heard one. You don't slow roast meat with savory herbs for medicine. He watched her guard that pot like it held a king's ransom, and the quiet mountain man decided he was going to find out exactly what she was hiding. By midnight, the temperature inside the cabin had plummeted despite the fire. The wood supply inside was dwindling. Cora had spent the last several hours sitting on a ragged cot, the Winchester resting on her lap. But exhaustion was fighting a winning battle against her adrenaline. Her head nodded, jerking back up every few minutes as she fought to stay awake. Finally, she realized the fire was dying. She looked at Silas, who was leaning against the log wall, his eyes half closed, seemingly asleep. "I have to get more wood from the lean-to," she muttered, mostly to herself. She set the rifle down on the cot, grabbed a shawl, and hurried to the back door of the cabin, slipping out into the freezing wind to gather logs. The moment the door clicked shut, Silas opened his eyes. He wasn't asleep. Survivalists never truly slept in the presence of strangers. He stood up silently, his heavy boots making barely a whisper on the dirt floor. He walked over to the hearth. His stomach gave another loud, hollow ache. Whatever was in that pot, it smelled too good to be poison, and if she was saving it for herself, it certainly wasn't deadly. Silas grabbed a wooden spoon resting on the stone mantel. He lifted the heavy iron lid. The steam hit his face. A complex bouquet of roasted meat, wild onions, and something distinctly sweet and sharp. He dipped the spoon into the thick, dark broth, blew on it to cool it, and took a bite. Instantly, Silas Caldwell went entirely quiet. He didn't choke. He didn't gasp. He just stood there, paralyzed, as a tidal wave of sensory memory crashed over him. The meat was elk, tender and perfectly braised. But it was the sauce that locked his muscles. It was seasoned with crushed juniper berries, wild sage, a hint of dried mountain currants, and Madeira wine. A very expensive, imported Madeira wine, reduced down with a pinch of star anise. Silas lowered the spoon slowly. The wild, untamed Bitterroot Mountains vanished from his mind, replaced by the glittering chandeliers of a grand dining hall in Denver, Colorado, 3 years ago. He knew this taste. It wasn't just a recipe, it was a signature, a culinary fingerprint. Only one man in the entire West demanded his game meats prepared with imported Madeira and star anise, the late, immensely powerful railroad tycoon and politician, Senator Harrison Sterling. And the only person who knew how to cook it perfectly was the senator's personal chef and his young, aristocratic wife. The back door rattled open, and Cora stepped in, her arms laden with firewood. She looked up, saw Silas standing over the pot with the spoon in his hand, and dropped the logs. They hit the floor with a loud, chaotic clatter. "I told you not to taste it!" she screamed, lunging for the Winchester on the cot. Silas was faster. He crossed the room in 2 giant strides, kicking the rifle out of her reach before grabbing her by the shoulders. He slammed her back against the cabin wall, not hard enough to hurt her, but firmly enough to show her the standoff was over. "Let me go," she thrashed wildly, her nails digging into his thick forearms. "You fool! You ignorant, stupid fool!" "Quiet," Silas barked, his voice booming with an authority he hadn't used in years. She froze, stunned by the sheer command in his tone. Silas stared down into her terrified eyes. "You said your name was Cora Smith. That was your first mistake. Your second mistake was cooking a stew with star anise and Madeira wine in a rotten cabin in the middle of nowhere." All the color drained from the woman's face. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. "I spent 10 years wearing a tin star as a deputy U.S. Marshal out of the Colorado District," Silas said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "Before I turned my badge in and walked into these mountains, my last detail was working security at a gala in Denver. I ate a bowl of elk stew from the kitchen of Senator Harrison Sterling. I never forgot the taste." Silas leaned closer, his eyes locked on hers. "The senator was poisoned the very next night, cyanide in his brandy, and his young wife vanished before the authorities could arrest her. There's a $10,000 bounty on your head, dead or alive." He let go of her shoulders and stepped back. "You aren't Cora Smith. You're Abigail Sterling, the Black Widow of Denver." Abigail slumped against the wall, sliding down until she hit the dirt floor. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with violent, silent sobs. The secret she had run 500 miles to hide, the identity she had starved and frozen to protect, undone by a moment of culinary nostalgia in the middle of a blizzard. She had warned him not to taste it, knowing that cooking, the only comforting thing she knew from her past life, was a deadly risk if anyone of high society ever found her. She just never expected a rugged, filthy mountain man to possess the palate of a Denver aristocrat. "Go ahead," Abigail whispered, her voice broken and defeated. She didn't look up. "Shoot me, or tie me up and drag me back to Denver. I don't care anymore. I'm so tired of running." Silas stood over her, his expression unreadable. $10,000 was more money than a man could spend in 3 lifetimes out here. It was a king's ransom. All he had to do was bind her wrists and wait out the storm. "Did you do it?" Silas asked softly. Abigail snapped her head up, her tear-streaked face contorted with sudden fierce anger. "No, I loved Harrison. I didn't kill him." "Then who did?" "His business partner," she spat, her eyes blazing. "Josiah Miller. Harrison found out Miller was using the railroad expansion to smuggle stolen gold across state lines. He was going to turn Miller over to the Pinkertons. Miller poisoned his brandy, and before Harrison's body was even cold, he paid the local sheriff to frame me." Silas crossed his arms, studying her. As a former marshal, he had a built-in lie detector, honed over years of dealing with cutthroats and conmen. He watched the micro-expressions on her face, the raw indignation in her eyes. She wasn't lying. "Miller put the bounty on me," Abigail continued, her voice trembling. "He didn't just want me arrested. He wanted me silenced. He hired regulators, trackers. They've been hunting me for 6 months. That's why I'm out here. That's why I'm hiding in this godforsaken icebox." Silas let out a long, heavy breath and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Well, Mrs. Sterling, it seems we have a problem." "A problem?" she scoffed bitterly. "You mean how you're going to transport me through a blizzard to collect your blood money?" "No," Silas replied, walking over to his saddlebags in the corner. He pulled out a heavy box of Winchester .44-40 ammunition and tossed it onto the cot beside her rifle. "I mean the fact that when I was riding up to this cabin, I saw fresh tracks in the snow. 3 riders heading up the ridge. I thought they were lost prospectors. But if what you're telling me is true, Miller's regulators just found you." Suddenly, over the howling of the blizzard outside, the unmistakable, sharp crack of a rifle shot echoed through the night, and the single window of the cabin shattered into 1,000 pieces. The shattering glass exploded inward like a spray of diamond dust, instantly followed by the deafening roar of a heavy-caliber rifle. The lantern on the rough-hewn table violently burst into metal shrapnel and flaming kerosene, throwing wild, dancing shadows against the log walls. Without a second of hesitation, Silas dove across the dirt floor. He hit the ground hard, his massive arm sweeping out to grab Abigail by the waist, dragging her down beneath the heavy oak table just as a second bullet tore through the very spot she had been standing. The slug buried itself deep into the cabin's timber with a sickening thud. "Stay down!" Silas roared over the shrieking wind. He scrambled on his hands and knees, kicking a tin bucket of melting snow directly into the hearth. A thick, suffocating hiss of steam erupted, instantly plunging the cabin into absolute freezing darkness. Outside, the blizzard raged, but Silas could hear the distinct, heavy crunch of boots pushing through the deep snowdrifts. "Caldwell!" A voice boomed from the darkness outside, barely cutting through the howling wind. It was a voice like grinding stones, rough and familiar. "I know that's you in there. I'd recognize that ugly black gelding tied out front anywhere. Send the woman out, Silas. William Pinkerton himself signed the warrant. $10,000. You can take half the bounty, and we'll ride away. Otherwise, we burn this shack to the ground with both of you inside." Silas pressed his back against the wall beneath the shattered window, his hand instinctively gripping the cold iron of the Colt peacemaker he had retrieved from the corner. He knew that voice. "Gideon Trace," Silas muttered, his jaw clenching. He turned to Abigail, who was huddled beside him, her breath coming in rapid, terrified gasps. "He's a contract killer out of Cheyenne, works for the highest bidder. If Josiah Miller hired him, Trace isn't here to take you back to a courtroom. He's here to bury you in the snow." Abigail's eyes, wide and adjusting to the dark, met his. The aristocrat from Denver was gone. The desperate survivor of the frontier had returned. She reached out, her trembling hands finding the Winchester rifle she had dropped during the initial chaos. She racked the lever, chambering a .44-40 round with a sharp mechanical clack that sounded incredibly loud in the small room. "I am not going back," she whispered, her voice laced with a venomous resolve. "And I am not dying in this icebox." "Then you'd best shoot straight, Mrs. Sterling," Silas said, a grim smile touching his lips. "Trace has 2 men with him. They'll try to flank us. You watch the back door. I've got the window." Another volley of gunfire erupted from the tree line. Bullets punched through the rotten wood of the cabin, raining splinters and dust down upon them. Silas didn't flinch. He waited for the muzzle flashes, bright, brief flares of orange in the blinding white storm. When he saw the first flash, he stood up slightly, rested his Colt on the windowsill, and fired twice. A sharp cry of pain echoed from the dark, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the snow. "One down," Silas grunted, ducking back just as return fire chewed up the window frame. Suddenly, the heavy wooden door at the rear of the cabin groaned. Someone was throwing their weight against it, trying to break the frozen hinges. Abigail spun around, bringing the Winchester to her shoulder. She didn't wait for the door to open. She aimed directly at the center of the thick pine planks and pulled the trigger. The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder. She pumped the lever and fired again, and then a third time, the thunderous reports leaving her ears ringing. Outside, a man screamed, followed by the sound of someone stumbling away, crashing blindly into the lean-to structure. Silence fell over the cabin, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the relentless wail of the bitterroot blizzard. Silas reloaded his Colt by touch in the dark, his senses straining for the slightest sound of Gideon Trace. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Suddenly, a faint scraping sound came from the roof. Silas's blood ran cold. Higgins's shack had a rotting cedar shake roof, and there was a wide stone chimney right above the hearth. Trace wasn't going to burn them out. He was coming down. "Abigail, move!" Silas shouted, lunging toward her. A heavy pair of boots dropped straight down the wide chimney chute, followed by the massive, fur-clad frame of Gideon Trace. He landed in the ashes of the dead fire, a sawn-off shotgun in his hands. He leveled the twin barrels directly at Silas. Silas threw himself sideways, bringing his Colt up, but Trace pulled the trigger. The blast deafened the room. Buckshot tore through Silas's heavy leather coat, grazing his ribs and ripping into his left shoulder. The impact threw him backward, crashing him into the woodpile with a groan of agony. Trace laughed, a cruel, breathless sound. He pumped the shotgun, stepping out of the hearth and aiming it at Silas's head. "Should have taken the money, Caldwell." Before Trace could pull the trigger, a deafening crack split the air. Trace froze, his eyes widening in shock. He looked down at his chest where a bloomin' red stain was rapidly spreading across his wolfskin coat. He swayed for a moment, the shotgun slipping from his grasp, and then collapsed forward into the dirt. Behind him stood Abigail, the Winchester smoking in her hands. She was trembling violently, the reality of what she had just done washing over her, but she didn't drop the gun. Silas let out a ragged breath, clutching his bleeding shoulder. He looked up at the wealthy socialite who had just saved his life. "Good shot, Mrs. Sterling." Dawn broke over the Montana territory with a brutal, piercing brightness. The Widowmaker storm had finally exhausted its fury, leaving behind a world buried in pristine, glittering white. Inside the cabin, the air was bitterly cold, but the threat was dead. Silas sat shirtless on the edge of the cot, grinding his teeth as Abigail tightly bound his shoulder with strips torn from her silk petticoat. She worked with surprising efficiency, having cleaned the superficial buckshot wounds with the last of his whiskey. "You're lucky," she murmured, tying off the makeshift bandage. "The thick leather of your coat took most of the impact. It's messy, but the bleeding has stopped." "I've survived worse," Silas grunted, rolling his shoulder to test the mobility. He winced, but managed a tight nod of approval. He looked at her, truly looking at her for the first time without the lens of a bounty hunter. Her face was smudged with soot, her elegant clothes were ruined, and she had just killed a man to save a stranger. There was a fierce, undeniable resilience in her that commanded his absolute respect. Abigail stepped back, wrapping her oversized woolen coat tightly around herself. She looked at the bodies outside, visible through the shattered door. "What now, Silas? The blizzard is over. Trace is dead. Are you going to tie me to your saddle and take me to Denver?" Silas reached for his shirt, pulling it on with a grimace. He walked over to the hearth, where the heavy cast-iron Dutch oven sat completely untouched by the chaos of the night. He grabbed the wooden spoon, stirred the cold, congealed elk stew, and took another deliberate bite. "I told you I was a deputy marshal," Silas said quietly, not looking at her. "I told you I worked security at your husband's gala." "I remember," she said, her guard instantly rising. "What I didn't tell you," Silas continued, turning to face her, "was why I was really there. I wasn't guarding Senator Sterling. I was investigating him and Josiah Miller." Abigail's breath hitched. She stared at him, stunned. "The federal government suspected Miller and your husband were using the Union Pacific Railroad contracts to launder stolen federal gold," Silas explained, his voice steady. "I was undercover. I found the proof I needed in Miller's private office the night of the gala, a black leather ledger detailing every stolen shipment, every bribed official." "You had proof?" she whispered, her eyes welling with sudden, furious tears. "If you had proof, why didn't you stop them? Why didn't you save Harrison?" "Because Miller caught me," Silas admitted, the shame of his past failure hanging heavy in the freezing room. "He had his men ambush me in the alley behind the estate. They beat me half to death, took the ledger, and left me in the gutter. By the time I woke up in a clinic 3 days later, your husband was dead. You were the prime suspect, and Miller had bought off the local magistrates. The Marshal Service told me to drop it. They said Miller was too powerful." Silas walked toward her, his imposing frame closing the distance between them. "I couldn't live with the corruption. I handed in my badge, bought a rifle, and walked into these mountains to disappear. I thought I had left it all behind." He reached out, his calloused hand gently brushing a stray lock of dark hair from her soot-stained cheek. The touch was surprisingly tender for a man forged in ice and isolation. "When I tasted that stew, I didn't just remember Denver. I remembered the failure that sent me into exile. I remembered the innocent woman I let take the fall." Abigail looked up into his icy blue eyes, the walls she had built around her heart over the last 6 months finally crumbling. "You didn't know, Silas? You couldn't have stopped him alone." "Maybe not then," Silas said, a dangerous, predatory glint returning to his gaze. "But I can now." He turned and walked over to Trace's body. He crouched down, searching the dead bounty hunter's pockets until he pulled out a thick, folded piece of parchment. It was a telegraph from the Pinkerton office, authorized by Josiah Miller, proving he was paying out-of-pocket bounties to silence witnesses. Silas stood up and held the paper out to her. "Trace brought us the final piece of the puzzle. Federal Judge Hiram Knowles is holding circuit court in Helena next week. Knowles is a hanging judge, and he hates railroad tycoons more than he hates horse thieves. If we bring him this telegraph, along with my testimony about the Union Pacific Ledger, we can hang a federal noose around Miller's neck." Abigail stared at the telegraph, hope, a terrifying, fragile thing, flaring in her chest. "He will kill us before we ever reach Helena." "He can try," Silas said, stepping closer, his presence a towering wall of protection. "But he sent his best men, and they're bleeding out in the snow. You aren't running any more, Abigail, and neither am I." He offered her his hand. Abigail looked at the rough, scarred palm. It was the hand of a killer, a lawman and a mountain man, but right now, it was the only safe place left in the world. She reached out and took it, her delicate fingers wrapping tightly around his. "Helena, then," she said, a small, fierce smile breaking through her tears. "Helena," Silas agreed. He glanced back at the hearth. "But first, heat up that stew. It's a long ride, and we're going to need our strength." As the morning sun hit the snow-capped peaks of the Bitter Roots, a solitary black gelding trudged down the mountain pass, carrying 2 riders. They were heading out of the wild, straight into the heart of a storm far deadlier than the snow, armed with nothing but a rifle, a dead man's telegraph, and the absolute certainty that hell was coming for Josiah Miller. The aroma of Madeira wine and wild herbs finally faded from the ruined cabin, leaving only the silent, freezing mountain behind. What started as a desperate woman hiding from the gallows transformed into a formidable alliance forged in cordite and survival. Silas Caldwell tasted an aristocrat's secret in a pauper's stew, unlocking a path to redemption for them both. Now, vengeance rode toward Helena.